back like we never left. It's Double Move Sports. Y'all already know what it is. Going into week 7, can you believe it already? As always, I'm Stef Albiero. I'm here with the fantasy phenom, Alex Lott, fresh out of his honeymoon. Say what's up to the people, bro.
Happy to be back. I'm a little rusty. Didn't get to watch all the games like I typically do on my honeymoon, but went a perfect 4-0 sweep on the weekend. I guess I had some of that wedding energy. Did pick up the piece of bling this weekend, so that is nice as well. Being married is weird. It's, for the most part it feels the same, but now I'm living in a new house. It's very different, but I know I'll get used to it. Stef, you're coming up here in a few months as well, so enough wedding talk. I'm excited to get into it this week. Stef, I did notice in our league of record, you're sitting atop the leaderboard by yourself at 5-1. How does that feel?
It feels great. The only thing is I'm in like the bottom half of the league in terms of points scored. So I got to get those points scored up. But Devontae Adams is back. My whole mindset was, can I just get through Adams being hurt?
Oh, yeah.
I feel a lot better about my chances now that he's back in the lineup. And I'm expecting big things from Adams this week. But week 6 was just one of those weeks. It's almost like the decision week for fantasy managers. You're trying to see what side of the hump you're on. If you're 4-2, that feels way better at this point than being 2-4. You're feeling good if you're 6-0 or 5-1. You're pretty much a lock for the playoffs. And if you need to start winning games ASAP, if you're 1-5 or 0-6 right now, the pressure is on at this point. We got 7 weeks left in the regular fantasy season, so a lot can still happen. That's why you guys got to listen to this show. We'll fill you in. Fun slate coming up here in week 7. And let's start, Alex, talking about one of the biggest headlines to start this week of football. It's Tua. It's Tua time, man. He's been named the starter. I know the Dolphins are on a bye this week, so we don't need to talk about their matchups that much, but just want to know, season long, what are the implications of Tua Tagovailoa now being the starting quarterback for the Miami Dolphins?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and we've heard it a lot, and we've talked about it. It's weird timing. I mean, Fitzpatrick is cruising with this Miami Dolphins team, has them at 3-3. They're right in the hunt in that division. And so very unique timing for Tua to come in. But I heard it said really, really well by Field Yates today, actually, on the Fantasy Focus podcast. And he said, in fantasy, you think about some guys like a James White is a good example. He's got a floor. He's going to give you 10 to 12 points a week. He's not a league-winning player, though, like someone who can break out, like maybe a J.K. Dobbins later in the season last year, guys like A.J. Brown. With the Dolphins, it's kind of the same. With Fitzpatrick, they know the floor is there. They might win 8 games. They might win 9 games. But if they're going to look into the future to next season, the year after, they need a league winner. Tua potentially could be that league winner for the Miami Dolphins, getting them to a Super Bowl. And I don't think that's going to happen this season. I think for fantasy football, I'm kind of keeping the status quo the same until further notice. If you are a Devontae Parker manager or even Myles Gaskin, you've got to be a little bit concerned just because a new rookie is coming in and Fitzpatrick was putting up really good volume. But outside of that, I think Tua can provide for these guys. And as a standalone quarterback, I think he is a flex or a streamer, not a flex guy, but a streamer in a 2-quarterback league. Definitely a super flex guy just because we know he can do it with his legs. He's got decent weapons in Parker Williams and Gesicki to throw the ball to, and they're definitely going to let it fly early and often. So it's an interesting move, but I think Tua is going to be fun to watch.
I think for Myles Gaskin, you brought him up there. I actually think this is a good move for him. They're not going to ask Tua to come out in his first game and do a bunch of crazy exotic things that we wouldn't expect from your standard run-of-the-mill quarterback. Can Tua be more accurate downfield than Fitzmagic? Can he be a little bit more conservative than Fitzmagic? I think so. But I think for Myles Gaskin, especially early on as they're kind of getting Tua worked into the offense, this is actually a great spot for Myles Gaskin to be. Didn't have the touchdown last week, but he's operating in a workhorse role. Love Myles Gaskin now and rest of season. And for Devontae Parker and even by extension, Mike Gesicki, Preston Williams, I think this creates a little bit of upside in the unknown. If you're in a desperation situation, might be worth it to just, hey, you're streaming tight end week to week. Try to see if you can throw Mike Gesicki in on a trade. See if you can get Preston Williams off the waiver wire after this bye week because there is upside in a new quarterback coming in. Could see a Justin Herbert-esque explosion from Tua here as the season goes on. Let's get into some of these other topics here. One of the ones I'm most excited about, a guy that I've been holding on rosters all season long. The breakout finally happened. Luckily, thanks to some bye weeks and some injuries, I was plugging him into my lineups. DeAndre Swift coming in and saving me on Kamara's bye week with a 27-point outing. against the Jacksonville Jaguars. What does this mean for DeAndre Swift season long? Is he, are you ready to say this is the status quo now? He's officially broken out? Because I'm not sure if I'm all in on that yet.
Yeah, I'm not all in on it either. And I know Adrian Peterson was still super involved in this game. This is one where the Lions jumped out early and they for essentially the entire game. And also the Jacksonville run D has been absolutely atrocious all season long. So a great matchup for Swift and Adrian Peterson. We saw Peterson get, 15 carries of his own and get a touchdown?
Yep.
So as long as AP is there and he's getting 10 to 15 carries a game, I think that really caps the upside that we're going to see for DeAndre Swift. Now, I will say it's really encouraging to see, and I think this takes Swift from kind of a desperation flex play to someone you can plug in at your RB2 spot and he has the upside. He's involved in the passing game as well. So definitely great to see. His value is definitely on the rise, but I would be very cautious. I don't think this is the breakout we've all been waiting for, and now he's going to be this 20 touch per game workhorse. But by all means, I think you can definitely lock him into your lineup, especially in a good matchup against Atlanta this week.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think he's a matchup dependent RB at this point. He's a guy that if I am in a losing scenario, if I'm sitting at a 2-4 record or 1-5 and I need to win right now, I am willing to sell Swift. Try to sell him as high as I possibly can to just get some other pieces in there that are going to be more reliable every single week. But I think Swift, if I'm a winning team, I'm trying to hold Swift because he has great matchups that you can start him in. He has Atlanta coming up here in week 7. That's a guy in start of the week contention against Atlanta. Then he has Minnesota, Washington, Carolina, Houston. Green Bay has been a defense that you can run against. So he's got some good matchups, especially down the stretch. I'm willing to continue to hold Swift and plug him in if I absolutely need to this week. What's interesting in that game, too, is that, like you said, Adrian Peterson out-carried him 15-14, but DeAndre Swift was extremely efficient. 8.3 yards per carry on 14 carries, had 2 touchdowns on the ground. The goal line work is the biggest takeaway for me. He was finally getting goal line work on the ground. Like, that's exactly what we need to kind of bring it full circle for Swift on top of the 4 or 5 targets that he's already getting on a weekly basis. I think that target volume has room to skyrocket against Atlanta, which is why I'm willing to plug him in. But at the same token, it's Matt Patricia. He's only playing Swift despite that impressive outing, only 38% of snaps. Adrian Peterson was at 20%. Kerryon Johnson was at 31%, saw 4 attempts and 2 targets of his own. So we'll see if Swift ever gets the reins of this offense under Matt Patricia's reign. But Swift's still a guy I want to hold and start in the right matchup. Let's talk about 2 more running backs here. Guys that are back-to-back in a lot of rankings that I'm seeing both this week, season long. Guys in very different situations, but are, for all intents and purposes, operating as these every down running backs. We'll see. We'll get into it here. It's James Robinson and Ronald Jones. And I wanted to pose the question for you. I thought it'd be a fun one for us to get into. Who would you rather have rest of season? James Robinson with the Jacksonville Jaguars or Ronald Jones on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers?
Oh, man, you're doing this to me. This one's really, really tough. I'm biased. Wow, this is tough. I'm going Ronald Jones. He's hot right now. I got to go Ronald Jones, and it's close. I mean, if I was going to rank these guys rest of season, I think they'd both be right there around the 12, 13, 14 number just because Robinson obviously is very involved in the passing game in Jacksonville, and he is that main back. But Ronald Jones, man, he's shown a ton of upside. He's finally getting going in this Tampa Bay offense, 3 straight 100-yard rushing games. Actually 5th in the NFL right now in rushing yards, more rushing yards than Zeke. We saw the touchdown upside this past week in a good offense when he got the goal line opportunities, and Mike Evans wasn't getting these 1-yard screen passes on the goal line. So in my opinion, yes, I know McCoy is involved in the passing game. I know Leonard Fournette's going to be coming back into the fold, but Ronald Jones right now is absolutely on fire, and I know Bruce Arians likes to go back and forth with his backs, but if you look at this backfield, the hot hand is clearly Ronald Jones. If he keeps getting 20 touches a game on the ground with that touchdown upside, running as good as he's been running, he's had a breakaway run, it feels like every single game for like 25, 30 yards, which is awesome. And no, he's not as involved in the passing game as James Robinson is, but he's still getting a handful of targets each and every game. It's not like he's a Marlon Mack from last season where he got like 14 targets on the whole season. I mean, Ronald Jones on the year, 25 targets in 6 games. That's 4 per game. That's not bad at all. So I think Ronald Jones actually provides a little bit of a floor in the passing game as well. give me Rojo, man. It's been awesome to see him still thrive with Fournette coming in there, because you and I both know, and anyone who's been listening knows, that I've been on the Rojo hype train for a long, long time.
It's true. It's true. And it's those investments in draft season are finally paying off for you. It's crazy because between these two players, they're both top 12 right now in PPR leagues. Both are right around 90 carries. Ronald Jones actually has a few more, 97 carries to James Robinson's 85, but both are about even. Both are at 26 and 25 targets respectively for each of them. So they're almost seeing the same volume. It's just which offense do you really want? Which offense is going to have better matchups? Part of me does want to say James Robinson in this scenario, and the only reason is because right now the Jacksonville Jaguars defense is giving up the 8th most points per game. So I think season long there's going to be more passing volume for James Robinson compared to Ronald Jones, where I think the upside for Ronald Jones and what you're banking on is the touchdowns. We saw him with 2 touchdowns in week 6, and we said preseason that Ronald Jones is one of these running backs that has double-digit touchdown upside, and if he does hit that double-digit touchdown mark, he is going to beat James Robinson, but you still have LaShawn McCoy fighting for pass-catching work, Keyshawn Vaughn coming in. Maybe, we'll see. I think there's an injury with Fournette that they're just not disclosing at this point, probably because he's in a contract year, probably doesn't want it to get out that he's a little bit more banged up than we probably think. He was a late inactive in week 6. I think Fournette is still going to try to come in and get some volume at some point. But at this point, I'm willing to say Ronald Jones is the guy there. But I still remains to be seen. Fournette's kind of this lurking monster in the shadows that could come out week 9, 10, 11, 12. Things are going to change over time. Whereas James Robinson, looks like Raquel Armstead is going to stay on the COVID hour list for probably the rest of the season at this point. And then we have Chris Thompson getting in there in garbage time situations, pass catching back. But I'm willing to look at Robinson because I think the game scripts are going to allow him to have more sustained pass catching volume. Whereas with Ronald Jones, you look at the Buccaneers defense, they're a top 8 team in terms of points allowed on the defensive side of the ball. They absolutely destroyed the Green Bay Packers. I don't think anyone saw that coming. That's the difference maker for me. It's just those defenses, but I'd love to have either of these guys as RB2s. At this point, they're both every week starters until we see otherwise.
Steph, and one more thing I want to say, in my film room I did on Ronald Jones before the season, check that out on our channel if you haven't already seen it. I highlighted how Rojo, people didn't realize how he had this big play, breakaway run potential. And no, they don't always go for touchdowns because he doesn't have that breakaway speed, but he's just making something out of nothing time and time again. He's 3rd right now in the NFL in runs of 20 or more yards, behind only Nick Chubb and Lamar Jackson. So Rojo's getting going. We're seeing those big plays. He's grinding, 4.9 yards a carry so far this season. And it's been awesome to see him come on. Really awesome for me too, just because I was so on Ronald Jones for the season. And Steph, I did convince my wife to draft Ronald Jones, and thank goodness he's gotten going these last 3 weeks. Otherwise, this marriage would have started out on a tough note. But luckily, Rojo's been getting going. Things are great, and starting off on the right foot. She's crushing it in her fantasy league too. So all good. Thank you, Rojo. Please keep it up.
4.8 yards per carry for Ronald Jones, 4.2 for James Robinson. And here's the last thing I'll say. We've seen it in Gardner Minshew's tendencies to target the running back position. He did it back when he was in college, and he's still doing it now. We saw Leonard Fournette have 100 targets last year. I think that type of receiving volume upside is there for James Robinson, and they've shown him to be the guy. So that's where the difference maker for is like in those defenses and that pass catching volume. But again, either one would love to have as an RB2 here. Let's talk about a trio of wide receivers, really an entire wide receiver situation for a team, and it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. They've been a hot topic this week, and you look at Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson. We're seeing the pendulum swing in different directions for all of these different names here. I first want to start about talking about Chase Claypool. This breakout for Chase Claypool is absolutely insane. He looks like DK Metcalf as a rookie last year, except he broke out in week 2 or week 3. And it's one of those things, it's like fool me once, fool me twice, fool me 3 times, shame on me. At this point, you got to plug Chase Claypool in. He's a wide receiver 2 on the week for me. I think he's a guy you got to plug him in. If you have him as a flex option, you should feel phenomenal about it. And in this matchup here against the Tennessee Titans, it's kind of this battle of the undefeated teams. It's a 50-point over-under. I think Claypool's going to absolutely eat. And Claypool didn't play more than 40% of snaps until week 3. He's had his bye week already, and he's still top 15 in deep targets in the NFL. He's second in the league in yards per reception. He leads the league in yards per out run, third in yards per target. Every catch that this guy gets is just dripping with fantasy points all over it. And he's currently 10th in fantasy points per game for wide receivers. Not to mention he has 6 touchdowns. I know that's going to get skewed by the 4 that he had in 1 week, which is just insane. That's never going to happen again for Claypool. But Claypool scored in 2 out of the first 5 games of his career. Like, you can't take that as a point against him. I think Chase Claypool is broken out. He's a proven stud. If I can buy him low still, if somebody thinks, hey, Deontay Johnson's going to come back and Claypool's going to get mitigated to a pure deep threat role, maybe even that happens. But either way, I want to have Claypool on my roster. Alex, are you with me here on this Claypool hype?
Absolutely. And you're so right. It took us a little bit of time to get on Chase Claypool. But to me, Steph, it reminds me of A.J. Brown last season. I remember A.J. Brown had a couple of these pop games early, but wasn't really that consistent. And then when he started getting snaps, it was just week in, week out. You see these monster plays from A.J. Brown, and you start saying to yourself, can A.J. Brown really do this each and every game to have value in my fantasy lineup? And if you went along for that A.J. Brown ride, you were very, very happy and likely made a run deep into your playoffs. So Claypool feels the same way to me this season. Yes, there's going to be some ups and some downs, but right now with this offense in Pittsburgh, the way that Big Ben is throwing the ball, the snaps and the targets that Claypool is getting, you have to keep putting him in your lineup until further notice. He's just producing week in and week out. And after not only the boom game, but to come back and get 78% of snaps, lead the team in snaps, you have to keep playing him, especially after the production he put up there. You said he was a solid wide receiver 2 on the week. What do you have, 17 points last week? So you have to keep rolling Chase Claypool out in your lineup until further notice. And if you were one of those big spenders on the waiver wire for Claypool, you definitely probably feel the same way. You didn't pick him up for nothing, and you're not going to be benching him at this point. So I love rolling him out there as a wide receiver too. With the volume he's getting, he actually has carved out a nice little floor for himself. And like we saw 2 weeks ago, we know exactly what the upside is. So I actually like Claypool more than any other Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver. And if I'm looking at the rest of the season, give me Claypool over Juju, over Deontay Johnson as well.
So we talked about Claypool. Let's kind of put him to this side. Let's talk about the other 2 Pittsburgh receivers that you're looking to start potentially every single week. Maybe not anymore for Juju, but it's Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson. Alex, are you with me on that? I would rather have Deontay Johnson rest of season over Juju Smith-Schuster.
Yeah, I'd rank these guys Claypool, Deontay, and Juju. Juju right now is not startable. I mean, he's maybe a flex. If he scores the touchdowns, he's there. But outside of that big week 1 game, he had a decent game in week 2 and 3, but he's totally fallen off of a cliff. And he's not getting the targets either. I mean, you look at these Pittsburgh Steeler targets, Claypool on the year, we know he was a rookie, got off to a slow start. He's at 24. Deontay Johnson's at 26 and missed a game. James Washington's at 26 and Juju's at 28. So Juju's not really getting significant target volume over these other guys, and he's not putting up any production with what he's getting. I mean, last couple games, 5 targets, 4 targets. You just can't have 4 or 5 targets from a guy who plays in the slot as close to the line of scrimmage as Juju does. I mean, he's averaging 8.4 yards per reception on the season. With 28 targets, that's just not going to get it done. So I'm out on Juju until we see something else from him. If you have the opportunity to sell based on name value, someone else thinks they're buying low, there are so many other guys I would take over Juju. If I had Juju, I'd throw offers out there for Chase Claypool and see if I can pick him up.
We'll see if you can get him. But yeah, I'm with you 100%, man. 17% target share. That's 50th amongst all wide receivers. And he's really been relegated to more of a slot guy, like you said. And even though the Steelers this year, have, kind of turned into like Big Ben's like game manager. They're not this high-flying offense you remember, even though Chase Claypool's having these great games. You would think in an offense where Big Ben's not trying to push the ball downfield that Juju's going to have a lot of value in that and see a high target share. Right now, his average target distance is 4.8 yards. That's 99th amongst all wide receivers. He's only seen 1 deep target on the year. He had the 2 touchdowns, but has only seen 4 red zone targets on the year, which is outside of the top 30. So you look across the board at almost every single metric. Juju's is down. I'm not sure if he, I've seen some people, some Juju truthers saying that maybe he's still a little bit hurt We saw him banged up all last year. There could be some of that. He's trying to shake off some of the injury rust, or maybe some of the injuries are popping back up for him. He's just not getting separation, whether it's near the line of scrimmage or a little bit more downfield in the middle of the field. He's just not getting it. And his yards after the catch doesn't look great either. So I'm not sure what's wrong with Juju. Maybe long-term he just needs a change of scenery. I think if you put him in the right situation, he can still dominate. I do still think he has juice, but as far as 2020 goes, we haven't seen that. So there's no reason to believe that it's going to come, even though, 2 years ago we had that 1,400-yard season. I think part of that just came from what everybody else said, like the Antonio Brown effect that allowed things for Juju to open up when Big Ben was throwing the ball almost 700 times in a year, wearing out that elbow. For Juju, he's just a guy, he's really not startable. I'm trying to sell him for anything that I possibly can at this point. Even like a Brandon Cooks that we're starting to see emerge, if you can get your hands on him. Any of these other kind of high upside wide receivers, guys that you at least can feel confident putting in a flex spot every single week, that's the value that Juju should be at. It's almost like DJ Moore to start the year. You just got to, it's a guy that you drafted to be a lot higher, but now you got to kind of change your perspective on him and view him as more of this flex play, or maybe even just a bench guy. So let's talk about some running backs that are on the bubble that you might be looking at as a desperation RB2 or a flex play. We'll go through our running back start sits. And guys, before we get into this, if you have any players that we did not mention, be sure to hit us up in the comments down below. We'll try to get to all of those. And we even did a live stream last Sunday, hopped on for about 2 hours before kickoff, the Sunday 1 p.m. Eastern time games. We're going through a ton of start sit questions. Had a bunch of guys ask me, hey, should I start Julio Jones with all this injury risk? I was like, no question, you got to plug him in if he plays, and it paid off. So shout out to everybody in that live stream. Hope we got a bunch of fantasy victories out of that. Last thing here, if you guys like the show, please hit that like and subscribe button. That is huge for us. But let's first talk about Jerick McKinnon. Now with Raheem Mostert out of the lineup, probably going to IR. We saw McKinnon have those big pop games, playing on like 97% of the snaps when Mostert was out of the lineup earlier in the year. Are you seeing things moving that way again for McKinnon here? Are you valuing him as an RB2 or even like an RB1 in the right matchup with Mostert out?
Yeah, I'm willing to play McKinnon this week. You just look at McKinnon splits with and without Mostert, and it's night and day. I mean, week 1 with Mostert in the lineup, 6 touches. Week 2 with Mostert in the lineup, 4 touches. Then Mostert's out for 2 games, and he gets 17 touches and 21 touches. Mostert comes back down to 3 touches, and then this past week he was out for, half of that game, got 8 touches. So my expectation would be that Jerick McKinnon's going to get 12 to 15 touches, maybe more in this offense. 12 to 15, I think, is the floor. I think 15 to 20 is kind of that ceiling. So I'm expecting McKinnon to be used early and often in this game. And I know JaMychal Hasty got some run there at the end last week, but I think they were just kind of trying to burn out the clock there. They had it in control. So, the Patriots obviously aren't a great matchup, but just knowing the volume McKinnon's going to get, we're dealing with all these injuries. We're dealing with bye weeks now. People don't have running backs just sitting around. And if you can get someone in an elite running scheme like San Francisco who's going to get you around 15 touches, you got to plug him into your lineup, especially when it's a pass-catching back like Jerick McKinnon. So I'm starting him if I've got him. I know he's been disappointing here for the last 2 weeks, but as an RB2, I think given the opportunity and the situation, you might just have to throw him in there.
I'm surprised that you're as high on McKinnon because I've typically been the one of us two who's been higher on McKinnon. I'm actually feeling like this is a trap game, and I'll tell you why. It's because earlier on those weeks without Mostert, we had Deebo Samuel out of the lineup. George Kittle was hurt. Brandon Ayuk was still getting worked in. I know he had some good games around that time as well. But part of me thinks that, with these other weapons here, especially the way that San Francisco's running this horizontal passing game, it was like 99% of Deebo Samuel's yards came after the catch. There's something ridiculous like that last week. They were just giving him...
Yeah, because they were all basically handoffs.
Pretty much. I mean, they're using Deebo Samuel like a running back at this point. That has me a little bit concerned for McKinnon, but there are definitely worse options there. If you have a desperation RB2 or you just got nothing at your flex, maybe you're hammered by these bye weeks, or got some injuries that have crept in, McKinnon's worth a start. I'm just holding back on him a little bit. I think some of the touchdowns that he had earlier in the year, he scored a touchdown in his first 4 games that he played this season. So unless you're getting that touchdown, I think you're going to be disappointed with Jerick McKinnon. I would view him as more of like a 9 to 12 point guy, and if that touchdown hits, you're going to be happy with it. But definitely worse options that you can have there. And JaMychal Hasty coming in and getting 21% of the snaps. I think that San Francisco might try to see what they have in him before they potentially move on as an undrafted free agent coming in. But I'm still with you. I think he's still a start if we're just talking purely start sit here.
Yeah, I think we both agree here. It's just I'm looking at it in an optimistic narrative, and yours is more pessimistic. Just for this take specifically, because we're kind of saying the same thing. Like
right.
McKinnon's not in my consideration for start of the week necessarily, but it's just one of those things where he has a good opportunity in front of him. So based on the landscape of fantasy football right now, he's someone you just need to start unless you're stacked and have other really, really strong options.
And this San Francisco team's not built to play from behind either. But then again, I don't know if New England is going to go run up the score on them. It's a tough matchup, which also makes me look at other options. But let's move on here. Enough about McKinnon. Let's talk about Phillip Lindsay, another guy who's benefiting from an injury in that backfield. We saw him last week against New England have a mediocre outing. It's one that if you started him, he didn't absolutely kill you. I think I would view him against Kansas City in Week 7 here as a low-end RB2 or a flex play. And we really know what Phillip Lindsay is at this point. He's a relatively efficient volume play. I mean, last week was like the epitome of what Phillip Lindsay is. 23 attempts for 101 yards. That's 4.4 yards per attempt. And then 0 targets. Granted, in that game, they didn't really need to pass the ball in a winning game script. They had a lead on New England most of the time. But Kansas City is a good matchup. They're 20th against the run. We know Kansas City is going to be able to put up points. And all you're hoping here is that the Broncos can move the ball, get Lindsay into the end zone, and just hope that they don't fall too far behind and have to air the ball out. I expect Lindsay to be a low ceiling, high floor play in the 10 to 14 range.
See, I struggle with that one because at the time of this recording, and Steph, correct me if I'm wrong, aren't they expecting to have Melvin Gordon back this week?
Let's do a spot check here real quick on the fly.
I think they are. So assuming Melvin Gordon's going to come back, it's tough because, one, he could be dealing with some discipline. Maybe Lindsay gets the start. But two, we just have such a small sample size of both Lindsay and Gordon on the field at the same time. The only game they played together was in Week 1. Melvin Gordon got 63% of snaps. Phillip Lindsay only got 32% of snaps. Royce Freeman had 10%. So I just look at these splits and I'm thinking to myself, if Phillip Lindsay's in that 10 carry range, if anyone's going to get the touchdown, my money would be on Gordon. If someone's going to get the receiving work, my money would be on Gordon. So, in a game where they could fall behind to Kansas City, in a game where Gordon and Freeman are going to be there's going to be kind of like a three-headed attack with Gordon leading the charge. I'm concerned about Phillip Lindsay. Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible for Lindsay to come out and get 15 carries because with Melvin Gordon getting that DUI, we don't know what his discipline is going to be. We don't know if Lindsay's going to come out and be the starter. We don't know what that's going to look like. But just with some of that uncertainty and on the off chance that the Broncos say, hey, the league will do their discipline process and down the line, Gordon will get a suspension. So we're going to play him now. That suspension's adequate. Maybe they come out and just give him the starting job and give him his full portion of snaps. So for that reason, I'm out on Lindsay, and I'd keep him on the bench this week.
Yeah, my take was based on Melvin Gordon not being there at all. I assumed that he wasn't going to play anymore, was going to face that suspension starting this week. But you're right, the official word has not come out. As of right now, Melvin Gordon is healthy and expected to play. No injury designation on him. Let's talk about Melvin Gordon. Is he a guy that, with Phillip Lindsay now back in the lineup, I'm not too keen on playing Melvin Gordon, and especially like he was sick last week. Maybe we could put sick there in air quotes, but are you trying to start Melvin Gordon either?
No, if I can avoid it, I'm avoiding it. I mean, you didn't have Melvin Gordon last week, so maybe your emergency plan crashed and burned and you took the L and you're like, I need Gordon back in my lineup, but I'm with you. I mean, for the same reasons, we don't know what this is going to look like. You're right, the air quotes to Melvin Gordon being sick and missing that game, we don't really know. So with Lindsay back, Steph, I know you were fading Melvin Gordon anyway, knowing Phillip Lindsay was going to come back. Add some of this other off-the-field drama into the mix, and I'd be a little bit worried about Gordon as well. I think you can start him, but if you do, you just have to be prepared for some funky stuff to happen, and maybe Lindsay gets a little bit more work and a little bit more run than he normally does.
Yeah, I'd view both of these guys for right now in kind of a high-end RB3 range, just high floor. I don't see a high ceiling for either of them if they're both going to be out there. on the field. And it was tough too because I had Gordon in some spots. I had him as my RB2 with like Miles Sanders as my 1 and then was loaded at wide receiver in some of those leagues. And I ended up shipping off Melvin Gordon for David Johnson because there were just some concerns there when Phillip Lindsay would come back. So you knew I was kind of seeing that and was trying to get ahead of it. And I feel like I was able to sell high on Melvin Gordon after those early performances. And then he had that big game against the Jets. But yeah, I'm not trying to start either guy outside of necessity here in Week 7. Now let's talk about James White. Finally, looked like the player that I was all over at his ADP in this draft season against Denver. He had 15.3 fantasy points, had 4 attempts on the ground for 8 yards, but then through the air, 9 targets, caught 8 of them for 65 yards. At this point, Edelman's not looking great. He hasn't had a good game in a minute outside of that Seattle game. So it feels like James White's going to have to become even more involved now in this offense as part of the passing game. And against San Francisco here in Week 7, I'm not too scared of the matchup. But what I am scared of is this being kind of a low-scoring game. So James White, for you, is he an RB2, RB3?
Yeah, I think he's a high-floor start just because we've seen James White be exactly what we expected him to be since he's come back. I mean, the last 2 weeks, he's been over 50% of snaps, kind of right in the range we would expect. And in those 2 games, 8 targets and 9 targets, he turned that into 7 receptions and 8 receptions. In a PPR league, if you're getting 7, 8 receptions out of your running back, I mean, you're getting a really high floor. So only 3 carries in his first game and 4 carries in his second game back on the ground. But that's not what you're looking for in James White. He's essentially a slot receiver out of the backfield. So if he's going to keep getting that snap percentage and keep getting work, I expect him to be very relevant. And you said it, this might not be a super high-scoring game with the San Francisco 49ers, but I expect it to be a competitive game, and I do expect the 49ers to score points. We talked about it earlier, Jerick McKinnon, Deebo Samuel, Ayuk, Kittle, some of these passing game options are back, and the 49ers offense looked pretty decent against the Rams. So the over-under in this one's only 43.5. Even with that being the case, I still think James White is going to get work in this game, enough to be a high floor play. He's not going to take the top off and go for 30 points, but if you need a safe option that's going to get you somewhere from 10 to 15, and if he falls in the end zone close to 20, I think you start James White.
Yeah, that over-under, I did not see that. That 43.5 point over-under is by far the lowest on the week. That's crazy. That's probably one of the lowest I've seen all year long. Now let's talk about this Rams backfield. A lot of people probably still have Cam Akers on their roster. If you have him, you can just drop him. For redraft purposes, I love what Akers might be next year, but for right now, you can't have a guy putting up 0 on a weekly basis.
He didn't get a touch.
He got 1 target that he did not receive. So, like, you look at that.
He got 1 snap.
I looked at
1 snap.
I looked at what Sean McVay said after the game, and he was just pretty much said, like, the game plan didn't involve Akers this week. And I was like, you said the week before that he was going to play. He was like a deep shot of the week for me in that San Francisco matchup. I thought was going to be a little bit more of a high-scoring game, and that Akers was going to see some pass-catching work there like he started to see earlier in the year when he kind of came off strong against Washington in Week 5, but it just didn't happen. Who knows? Maybe the injury is still bothering Akers, but he can't be a guy that you just have stashing or waiting. He's going to be a roster clogger at this point and still has his bye week coming up here in Week 9. But for Darrell Henderson, had a rough outing, only 14 attempts for 88 yards. It was a very efficient 6.3 yards per carry, but didn't even see
ran well.
Yeah, didn't see a single target, though. But I'm starting to think Henderson is like the clear RB1 in this backfield. Is really turned into what I wanted Akers to be.
Yeah, this is interesting because Henderson, this is the first game he's been over 50% of snaps. Even as Henderson has emerged, listen to these snap count percentages for Malcolm Brown on the year. I'll do all 6 weeks. 60% in Malcolm Brown's breakout Week 1. But since Brown has taken the backseat, 54%, 49%, 61%, 38%, 45%. So that is more of a Darrell Henderson stat than it is a Malcolm Brown stat, just because Henderson isn't out there as the workhorse. And the fact that Cam Akers is playing, a handful of snaps a game, there's, nowhere to go but down, in my opinion, for Darrell Henderson, because I don't think they're suddenly, Sean McVay's not just going to start giving him 75% of snaps. But, at this point, he's a low-end RB2 or a flex. It's rolling the dice every time you play Darrell Henderson. We've seen the highs. We've seen the lows. Even in this game, he only got 53% of snaps, but 14 carries for 88 yards. If he gets a touchdown in that game, he turns everything around. So you're really relying on Henderson getting into the end zone. Now, on this Rams team, It seems like he's going to be the goal line back. But then again, who knows when they're going to get down inside the 5 and Malcolm Brown or Cam Akers comes onto the field. We just don't know. So to me, Darrell Henderson is more of a desperation RB2 or a flex. I'm trying to sit him if I can, just because it's impossible to predict at this point. And when you play him, you just have to pray it's going to be one of his big weeks, and you have to pray you're not going to bench him during one of his bad weeks. It's just one of those situations. And Steph, I want to show you the most interesting stat of the week. Darrell Henderson last week had 0 receptions for 4 receiving yards because he got a hook and ladder from Cooper Kupp. So go figure. I was looking at this box score, and I was like, this cannot be right. But it is. This guy is doing literally something out of nothing. So, but again, Cam Akers, you can drop him. Malcolm Brown, deeper league, maybe you stash him in case there's an injury. He's more of a handcuff at this point. And Darrell Henderson, start him at your own risk.
Start him at your own risk, but he's a desperation RB2 if you need it. If you're looking at him as a flex option, it's like you probably have a wide receiver, probably one on waivers that you can just stream for a week, who's going to be a higher upside play than Darrell Henderson. But I would love to see what he would look like, at a more of a 70% snap share. It just sucks, and it feels like that's with all the Rams, with their tight ends, with their wide receivers. It's just kind of the roulette wheel. What's McVay going to come up with this week to get the ball into the hands of his playmakers? In one game, it might be a Henderson game. It might be, by the end of the year, we might see some Akers games in here. But you're never going to know when to start him. But for right now, ride the hot hand in Henderson.
As far as the eye test goes, Henderson, in my opinion, has by far looked the best of all the running backs in that backfield. So surely Sean McVay and this coaching staff is seeing the same thing. So we'll see. I mean, again, I think we've hit on this well enough. Just keep an eye on it. Keep monitoring the snaps, the touches every single week. And if nothing changes, Henderson is that kind of flex guy. But Steph, let's go ahead and move over to some wide receivers. I want to stay on the Rams. These are start sits at the position. Cooper Kupp's the first name on our list. He was disappointing last week, only 3 receptions for 11 yards, but he did have 9 targets. This is his first real stinker week of the season. Maybe week 1 with only 4 for 40, but Steph, what are we doing with Cooper Kupp? In my opinion, you roll him out there every single week. He's seeing 80-90% of snaps every single game. The 9 targets were still there in this one. He dropped a touchdown. He barely got turned around on a deep ball that could have gone for a long touchdown. So, in my opinion, Cooper Kupp is locked into my lineup. Don't overreact and put him on your bench just yet.
What's crazy is that Cooper Kupp ended 2019 as the wide receiver 4 on the year. I think those days are probably behind him. Part of that is just the offense in general. We saw Robert Woods. Like, Robert Woods is a wide receiver 1 right now. And that's what we said before the season. It was just like, volume-wise, skill set-wise, we just don't think Cooper Kupp, unless he's getting a ton of touchdowns, he's not going to be a guy that you want to start in fantasy. But you're right. That upside is still there. We've seen him have the big weeks. He had that 25-point game against Buffalo, 17 points against the New York Giants. Against Chicago, which is a tough matchup for wide receivers, you still have to plug him in there because for all we know, McVay's sitting right now in his mansion in LA scheming up, hey, this is a Cooper Kupp game. We want to get him involved. We want to get him in the end zone, in the red zone. So for those reasons, you have to start Kupp. It's just one of those situations where he's going to give you a lot of volatility. Some weeks he's going to give you 5. Other weeks he's going to give you 25. You never really know when they're going to come. Like, you might look at the matchup and think it's good, but the matchup is no guarantee on what his production is going to look like. You're hoping for the touchdown with him, but he's a guy that does score a lot of touchdowns. Kupp is just a guy that I'm not valuing. Like, people are probably going to overvalue him based on name height, based on the good weeks that he's had this season. I've now dropped him down to a low-end wide receiver 2, which is about where he is. He's the wide receiver 24 on the year. So let's talk about a start-sit decision that's been keeping me up at night almost every single week. And the 2 players here are Brandon Cooks and DJ Chark. I'm leaning towards the Chark side. Starter sit DJ Chark after a pretty disappointing outing in week 6. He didn't kill you, but only 11.5 fantasy points. That's coming off a 4-point week in Houston. He did get hurt in the 4th quarter, but that was the 4th quarter. We've seen a really low target volume thus far in the season, but Chark is coming off a 14-target game. He just wasn't able to get into the red zone. He wasn't able to get a ton of yardage. How do you feel about DJ Chark, and would you start him over Brandon Cooks this week?
Oh, this is tough.
Cooks is against Green Bay. Chark is against the Chargers.
This is a really tough one. To me, I think I would like to start both. I think they're both good flex options, maybe even wide receiver 2 options. And this is going to sound crazy, but I think I would go with Brandon Cooks. I think I would lean with Brandon Cooks and ride that hot hand in Houston. Since Bill O'Brien has been gone, this is what's interesting to me. It's one thing to see Cooks with this low target volume with that 0-point week in week 4. And then you see the last 2 weeks, 12 targets, 9 targets, 8 for 161 and a touchdown, 9 for 68 and a touchdown. It's one thing to say, okay, the status quo is the same, nothing has changed, and Cooks had a couple of hot games. But to me, the fact that Bill O'Brien is now gone and then Cooks all of a sudden is emerging as this top wide receiver, to me, that is more substantial than if everything was the same, because I think Brandon Cooks is truly emerging as the number one on this team, and I don't think that can be ignored. I mean, 83% of snaps, 88% of snaps in the last 2 games.
Over Will Fuller.
Cooks' snap counts have been through the roof this season. I mean, he and Fuller are essentially the 1A, 1B on this team. To be fair, okay, maybe him and Fuller are about even, but if you're willing to roll out Will Fuller, I think you have to be willing to roll out Brandon Cooks. The targets are there, the snaps are there. Deshaun Watson is obviously an elite quarterback, and they're playing the Green Bay Packers in a game where I expect them to have to throw the ball. So I'm going to lean with Brandon Cooks on this one. Now, I will say I don't think DJ Chark is a bad option. He did see 14 targets last week against Detroit, only turned that into 7 receptions for 45 yards. The Jaguars are spreading the ball around a lot this season. Keelan Cole's been really involved, Laviska Shenault. And at the end of the day, it's close, but the matchup to me is better for Cooks. The quarterback is better for Brandon Cooks, and he's on a hot streak right now. So I think you have to ride that out and roll the dice.
Yeah, it's like the Chase Claypool situation. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times. It's not going to happen. So I probably botched that one worse than George Bush. But regardless here, the thing about DJ Chark is that he has all the kind of peripheral statistics. So while the box scores may not be massive, he's had that one boom week. He's still on a team that throws the ball 4th most in the NFL on a per-game basis. He's also 2nd amongst all wide receivers right now in red zone targets. I think it's only a matter of time before the rubber meets the road with Chark and he returns back to a little bit more of what he was last season, a more consistent start. I know some of the injuries here might eat into this upside a little bit, and that may have been why we saw a lower yardage total even on those 14 targets. He only caught half of them, but even then he only put up 6.4 yards per catch. So 7 catches for 45 yards. It's not great there. You want to see more than that, especially from Chark, where a lot of what he does is get those deep receptions. Where he was making his hay is, going up and get it downfield. So when you see things like that, it is a little bit concerning, but I'm nowhere near as concerned for Chark as I am with a guy like Juju in that way, even though they're kind of seeing the same problem here. But those 14 targets can't be ignored. I think Chark's going to be relied upon. It's just one of those things where, again, just like Cooper Kupp, there's a level of volatility to expect with the other options emerging. And one you didn't throw out there is James Robinson, because James Robinson's seeing a lot of targets as well. So, it's just something where the distribution is a little bit farther out. But to see 14 targets, anytime you see double-digit targets from a wide receiver, I think you got to go back to the well and plug them back in. But I think you're right. I would go Brandon. You've convinced me, I should say.
It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good to say Brandon Cooks over DJ Chark this week, but you look at the matchup, the Packers versus the Texans, it is the highest over-under on the week, a 57-point over-under.
57. It's up to 57 now. Wow. It moved past Detroit, Atlanta. So wow.
It's supposed to be, for all intents and purposes, a high-scoring game. We'll see if it actually shakes out that way. I feel like, a lot of these games this year where we've expected these really high point totals, we've been a little bit disappointed, whereas all the other games that we didn't expect to be high scoring have kind of done the opposite. But regardless, I think you're right. And you made great points there on Brandon Cooks. And it was a guy that I took some shots on in some places in drafts this year because, the wide receivers that break out typically come from, ambiguous depth charts. You don't know if there's a clear one. Is it a 1A, 1B? You don't really know. And that's what Brandon Cooks is. We know Brandon Cooks is good when he's healthy. He had that year last year where he had the concussion issues, the neck issues with the Rams. But now that he's come back, he looks like the receiver that he's been on 3 different other teams where he's put up 1,000 yards on those different teams and in those seasons. So I think you're right. I think you do have to plug in Brandon Cooks, and anytime there's that upside, whether it's the Will Fuller upside, whatever we want to call it, Brandon Cooks could be a guy who gets 2 deep balls and takes them for touchdowns. Especially late in the game. If this is a shootout with Green Bay, you're going to want to have Brandon Cooks in there. And for, if Chark goes off on my bench. I think I'm going to be all right with it after some disappointing outings the last 2 weeks. Whereas with Brandon Cooks goes off on my bench again, I'm going to be kicking myself because now that's the third week that he's exploded. Luckily, did have him in some lineups last week. So I think I'm going to ride the hot hand here out of these two with Cooks, but I think both are starts if we're talking start-sit. Don't fade either one. Cooks, thinking he's going to return to earth, or DJ Chark seeing these last 2 weeks and thinking that he's going to bust again. I think both can have great weeks here in week 7. Now let's talk about a rookie wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy, coming off a pretty disappointing performance against the Patriots last week. He only caught 2 of his 5 targets for 32 yards, 5.2 fantasy points. Totally crapped your week if you started him. And the interesting thing with Jeudy is that, and really this whole Broncos offense, is that the defense is what's winning them games this year. And Drew Lock doesn't need to pass. Drew Lock had less than 25 pass attempts in this game because their defense is winning them games. So shout out to Vic Fangio and Ed Donatel, the defensive coordinator, because right now...
Huge win over New England. What an upset.
Right now, the Broncos offense is 28th in the league in points scored, but their defense is putting up 22 points a game, and they're in the top 12 in terms of fewest points allowed this season. So that defense, even with Von Miller hurting out, a couple of other injuries they've had, is really, really good. I don't have a ton of faith in Jeudy this week. He's going up against Kansas City. I think in this game you're hoping for garbage time or them to be in comeback mode. I think it could definitely happen here, but it's supposed to be a pretty low-scoring game. The over-under is only 46, so Vegas thinks this is going to be pretty low-scoring. I think the Chiefs will dominate them, and the Chiefs' defense hasn't been a slouch either, especially against wide receivers. So your hope is that the volume's going to be there because of the comeback mode, and what we're actually seeing is that Tim Patrick, this guy that nobody expected, has just absolutely exploded and really shown to be the wide receiver 1 in this offense without Cortland Sutton. So it's something where for Jerry Jeudy, I think season long, he's still a hold. He's still a guy who's going to have big weeks. I think it's only a matter of time before he breaks out like some of the other rookie wide receivers that we're seeing. But against Kansas City, I don't want to start him. Do you?
No, I'm with you. I think this one's pretty easy. You just can't start Jerry Jeudy right now. You look at his season, and he's done nothing necessarily spectacular. I mean, here's his PPR point totals. 9, 10, 10, 14, where he had a 38-yard touchdown reception that saved his week, and 5. So with Drew Lock and everything you laid out about this offense, you can't start Jerry Jeudy right now. This one's easy. Keep him on your bench. I think maybe we could see a breakout later if Drew Lock gets going again back from his injury. If Jeudy can start to pick things up as well as a rookie, maybe we see this Broncos offense improve. Right now, you're keeping Jeudy on your bench.
All right, last wide receiver we'll talk about here, a guy that, was so disappointing. I had him in my lineup on Monday Night Football. Was too late. I didn't have any other options. I had to play him up against Stephon Diggs. That went horribly for me because it's Michael Gallup. He has Washington this week, coming off that horrible performance from really the entire Cowboys offense and defense. Only 4.3 fantasy points in that game. He had 6 targets, caught 2 of them for 23 yards. We saw back-to-back kind of goal line fades that Gallup ran, and they looked to him both times. That is what gives me confidence for Gallup season long. But are you willing to start him against Washington?
No.
Who is number 1 against wide receivers right now?
Steph, you know why Washington's number 1 against wide receivers?
Because you can run all over them?
Because everyone can run it on them, get a 14-point lead, and not need to throw the ball for the rest of the game. And after what we saw from Andy Dalton last week, I wouldn't be surprised to see the Cowboys do the same thing with Ezekiel Elliott. And no, I'm not really willing to start Gallup this week. I'm trying to look for other options if I can. Now, there's always the chance he goes for that big 50-yard touchdown play. He's truly boom or bust. He's only getting, 5-6 targets a game so far this season, 34 targets in 6 games. So you're really just hoping for that big play that goes for a touchdown. It could happen against Washington, but after what we've seen this season, he's had one big week, so I'm definitely not going to bank on it this week. He is seeing snaps. He's seeing even 81% of snaps last week was his lowest on the season, so he's out there just about all the time. But with Andy Dalton and all these options, Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb seems to be the number 2 target for this offense. Then you got Dalton Schultz in the mix and Zeke, who's going to run the ball all over Washington. I don't see myself starting Michael Gallup this week. Sure, in a deeper league, maybe a 3 wide receiver or a 2 flex league, you throw him out there and hope for that upside. But I'm trying to avoid if possible.
He might be worth a buy low especially in the deeper leagues like you're talking about. I mean, that defense in Arizona that they went up against is actually a very good defense. They're allowing their top 5 in points against this year. So they're not allowing any offenses to really get going on them, which is a complete contrast to last year for the Arizona Cardinals. Their defense has stepped up. I think they're going to actually be a sneaky team, a playoff team potentially, that could make a run if they get hot at the right time. But I still think Gallup, because of the targets that he's going to get, it's actually been better with Andy Dalton in the lineup. Granted, it's only a 2-game sample size, and one of those, Dak was in for about, a quarter and a half. But we are seeing a little bit more of a higher target share with Andy Dalton in there. But you're right. He's not really a guy that you want to start. But again, in deep leagues, I think he's worth a buy low, maybe even as a trade throw-in, as a guy who could have some boom weeks later on in the year. The schedule opens up a lot for Dallas down the stretch. So let's get into our favorite segment every week. It's our starts of the week, our strong starts, the guys that you're kind of on the bubble. Hey, should I start them? Maybe they're coming off a rough game. Maybe it's a tough matchup. Whatever it might be, we want to give you our stamp of approval to say, hey, plug this guy into your lineup over other options.
Hit some big ones last week.
We did.
Your Debo pick was hot.
I know you were giving me a little bit of flack for that one off that disappointing outing from Debo, but I was man, he's going to blow up this week. You had some good calls too.
Justin Jefferson, number 1 receiver on the week. It was a big one. It was nice to see. So, Stef, let's get this thing started. I want to hear your quarterback start of the week. Give me some Debo Samuel energy with this pick. Who should we be rolling out there at quarterback expecting a big game here in week 7?
Yeah, that's the game with the second highest over-under this week behind that Green Bay-Houston matchup, and it's Detroit versus Atlanta. It's my quarterback start of the week, Matt Ryan. You got to plug him in there right now. Nice. He's sitting as the QB 10, and with Julio Jones healthy and in the game, and against bad defenses, Detroit's 23rd against QBs. They're pretty much in the bottom half in every single category versus wide receivers, versus running backs, versus tight ends. So whatever it is, no matter what, if it's an offense that's going to score, and we know Atlanta's defense isn't going to stop anybody, you have to plug Matt Ryan back in. I know he's coming off that Minnesota game, and that Minnesota game where he had 32 fantasy points really set the blueprint for what Matt Ryan can be and what his upside is, and we've seen him be close to that 30-point mark or over it in about half his games this season, and those 3 games are with Julio Jones out of the lineup. So at this point, the pattern, talk about pattern recognition, it's pretty clear at this point. If Julio Jones is healthy, you got to start Matt Ryan in a matchup against Detroit. I think it's going to be a high-flying one. We'll see if the Falcons can get up to a lead and not blow it in this game. But I'm going Matt Ryan as my start of the week.
I like it, Steph. I like it. I'm staying right there in that Falcons-Lions matchup. I'm going with Matt Stafford. And I know he's felt disappointing so far this season, but he hasn't killed you. He's averaging 17.9 fantasy points per game, and you laid it out. The Falcons-Lions game is going to be an absolute shootout, and it's because the Falcons are getting absolutely gashed on defense this season. Stafford's got his weapons. He's got Kenny G out there. Hawkinson's looking great. I know Marvin Jones has been a little bit banged up in practice. I think he might just have his pride hurt. Maybe that's his injury for how bad he's been so far this season. But I know that was a low blow. We love MJJ here on the show. So maybe this is a bounce back opportunity for him. But it's all about the matchup, man. I mean, you look at what Atlanta's giving up to the quarterback position. We're here in week 7. We're through 6 full games. I'm going to read how many points each quarterback has put up against the Atlanta Falcons. 31, 39, 28, 29, 20, and 23. One of those was Mitch Trubisky as well.
Wow.
Actually, I think that was actually the Trubisky-Foles half and half game.
It was the comeback. It was another one of those heartbreakers.
Gave up 28 total points in that game. I mean, Kirk Cousins is in there, Teddy Bridgewater, and then Rodgers, Dak, and Russell Wilson. So all over the board with, the perceived talent, skill level of these quarterbacks. Stafford's a good quarterback. He's going to come out hot in this game and have a really, really nice one. So if you've got Stafford, keep rolling with him. If he's on your waiver wire, pick him up, throw him out there. He's going to have a big game.
So starts the week at QB coming from the same matchup. You love to see that. I think really that's a statement saying, look, start all your Lions that are on the bubble. We talked about DeAndre Swift as a desperation RB2 or flex this week. If you want some upside from him after that big outing, you gotta love Kenny Galladay, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Todd Gurley even. A lot of great options in this one. Hayden Hurst, you might take a flyer on him as well. We might hear a little bit more about him later on. But my running back start of the week is Antonio Gibson. That's right. It's time.
Very nice.
The upside's happening. The breakout. We saw a 22-point game from Antonio Gibson against Baltimore of all matchups in week 4. And even though the snap percentages haven't been there, you see what DeAndre Swift just did on about the same snaps, about 36% of snaps. That's exactly what Antonio Gibson saw against the New York Giants. I was expecting better things from Gibson in that Giants game, but against Dallas is giving up the second most rushing yards per game amongst all defenses in the NFL. They're 22nd amongst all teams against the running back in fantasy. So the matchup is great. We know the points are going to be there. I think Dallas's offense is going to get it back together, be able to move the ball a little bit, even if it's just feeding Zeke 100 times in this game. Regardless, I think they're going to need to score. That gives you room for pass catching volume. Now, J.D. McKissic is a guy who we could consider as a deep sleeper as well, just by extension. But I think Gibson's going to have a good game. I think he's going to be there. He's had 3 touchdowns in 6 games played to start his career. I think we could see another touchdown, maybe even 2 touchdown upside in this game. Love Gibson in DFS, and he's my start of the week at the running back spot in week 7.
I love it. At my running back position, I'm going with Ronald Jones. I'm going with my guy against the Las Vegas Raiders. He's been so hot. You just got to ride this wave. I mean, look at his last 3 games. He's averaging 20 carries per game, 5 targets per game. He's turned that into over 100 yards in 3 straight weeks. I know Leonard Fournette's expected back this week. I'm not worried about it. I think Rojo is still going to get somewhere from 15 to 20 carries, and he can turn that into 100 yards and a touchdown with some receiving work as well. The Bucs just curb stomped the Packers. I expect them to go into Vegas this week, a team that is 31st against the running back in fantasy football this year. And I think they're going to run the ball all over them. So look for Rojo this week to have another big game. If you've been rolling him out there these past couple weeks, keep it going. I wouldn't sell high just yet. I think other people perceive Rojo to not be as good as he's actually been, so you're not going to get the value for him that you deserve. Keep riding that wave, keep riding that production, and put Rojo in your starting lineup.
Nice. Yeah, we've taken so many victory laps already on Ronald Jones. I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. Just crazy that for what he's done, his ADP was so low. So many people were. He was a very polarizing option to take in drafts. People were saying he's garbage, he's trash, he's not going to be able to do it. And then we had other guys on the other end of the spectrum, which you were definitely on, which was like, this guy has what it takes to take over if they're going to give him the opportunity. And it looks like so far he's going to do that. And with this Leonard Fournette injury, could happen a little bit longer than we expect. And they got some good matchups in there. Carolina twice as well. So love that Ronald Jones start of the week there. I got another rookie as my wide receiver start of the week, and it's T. Higgins. T. Higgins has played 81% of snaps in 3 out of the 6 games he's played to start his career. I don't even count that first game. He played 21% of snaps and just didn't even see a single target in week 1. And then after that, he's been at 60% of snaps or higher pretty much every single week. And he's coming off of now 4 double-digit outings, a 21-point outing against Philly, 13 against Jacksonville, 10 against Baltimore, and then 18 in a matchup that was pretty questionable in Indianapolis. Thought that might be a tough one for T. Higgins, but he's played extremely well. And it looks like it's a guy that Joe Burrow has wanted to target early and often, is really taking over that A.J. Brown role. And the best part is Cincinnati's defense can't stop anybody, and they're up against Cleveland, who's 30th amongst defenses against wide receivers in 2020 so far. I think they're going to be able to pass the ball. I think this is just like we saw last time in this Cleveland-Cincinnati matchup. It's going to be a high-flying game. We saw Joe Burrow have 60 pass attempts in that game the last time these two met. I think we could see a very similar situation again. Love a lot of the Browns this week, Kareem Hunt, Odell Beckham, and for that reason on the Cincinnati side of the ball, I'm willing to plug T. Higgins back in there. Don't fade the rookie build-up or anything like that. You've got to plug him back in after that 18-point week in week 6. So T. Higgins, start of the week. Alex, who you got?
Love that. I love it. I love the trade you just made for him in Dynasty as well. Traded away my start of the week in that deal, Terry McLaurin, who plays against the Dallas Cowboys this week. And Terry McLaurin had a decent week last week, 7 for 74. It was on 12 targets, which is great to see. The week before, he only had 3 for 26. So maybe a little bit disappointing here in the last 2 weeks. You got to keep rolling him out there. This is a great matchup for McLaurin against the Dallas Cowboys, who are giving up a cool 36 points per game so far this season. Terry McLaurin is the only guy there in Washington. I mean, they're bringing in practice squad guys and elevating them to the roster who are probably going to get significant snaps because the rest of their receivers are so banged up. I love McLaurin. I think he's going to get somewhere from 12 to 15 targets in this game against a beatable Dallas Cowboys secondary. Yes, he might be matched up against Trayvon Diggs, but I think he's going to be able to roast him. I mean, he's a rookie who's played very, very well, but McLaurin is still going to get his in this game. So I love McLaurin. At this point, to me, he's an every week start. I know he might have been disappointing for the last 2 games, but don't get too weird, especially in a good matchup. I know he's on the Washington football team, and things have gone terribly wrong, but this team's 1 game out of the NFC East, so they're still playing for something. Roll out Terry McLaurin. I love the matchup. I love him as a talent, and I think he's going to have a big Week 7 against the Cowboys.
Nice. I like a lot of pieces on both sides of the ball in that game, but definitely Terry McLaurin. He's an every week auto start stud, regardless if it's Kyle Allen, Alex Smith, or Dwayne Haskins back there. But I'm going to talk about our tight end starts of the week. Alex, I'll have you start this one off. Who you got?
I'm actually going with TJ Hawkinson against the Atlanta Falcons.
Yes.
We talked about that shootout coming up. And TJ Hawkinson, I expect him to see a decent amount of targets in this game. He's coming on. I mean, his targets have been very conservative so far this year. He's seeing about 5 targets a game, but he is being utilized in the red zone. He scored a touchdown in 3 of 5 games this season. And in a game where there's going to be a lot of passing volume to go around, we expect Matt Stafford to have a big game. I think TJ Hawkinson is going to be the recipient of a decent amount of targets in this one, and he has as good a chance as anyone to score a touchdown in this game. In a year where the tight end position is so depleted, TJ Hawkinson in this matchup, to me, is just like a diamond in the rough for someone you can start and feel confident in. So roll out TJ Hawkinson in this game. I know he only had the 2 for 17 with the touchdown last week, which doesn't necessarily feel great. But at the tight end position, especially this year, you can do a lot worse, and it's really, really hard to get production on a week in and week out basis. So if you've got Hawkinson, roll him out there with confidence this week against the Atlanta Falcons.
If your tight end can just score a touchdown, like that's already a massive win at your tight end spot in most leagues.
I mean, Steph, listen to some of the top 10 tight ends last week. Anthony Ferkser was number 1. We had Trey Burton at number 3, Darren Fells at number 5, Adam Shaheen at number 8, Logan Thomas at number 9, Nick Boyle at number 10. So, I mean, you had Kelsey, Kittle, Gronk, and Hayden Hurst mixed in there, and everyone else was an absolute dart throw.
It's crazy. You know, that tight end scoring opportunity is really what we're looking for, and that's why my tight end start of the week is really what do we want to call him here? I don't want to be too mean. It's Jimmy Graham is who it is. Guy's probably old enough to be my grandpa at this point, and you know he's coming off.
He looks like.
I mean, right now he's the tight end 7 in PPR leagues. Like he's a top 12 tight end, a guy that probably wasn't even drafted in most leagues. And he's been relatively consistent, really only had 1 game where he was below 8 fantasy points. And if you're getting 8 points a week from the tight end spot, that's actually a lot to ask from a tight end that's not one of the big 4 in Kelsey, Kittle, Andrews, or Waller. And so for that reason, if you're looking for a tight end there out on waivers, maybe a guy you have stashed, you know, we got a lot of bye weeks here. You know, Zach Ertz is now gone with injury. And so now you look at Jimmy Graham, a guy that just put up 8 fantasy points last week. He did play 67% of snaps, so that's pretty much what he's been all season long. And we saw Cole Kmet, the rookie tight end, getting some usage as well. That's a kind of a deep dynasty name to keep an eye on, maybe even a really, really deep redraft name. But if those go from Cole Kmet over to Jimmy Graham, both are the tight ends that are looked to in the red zone. I think you can expect Jimmy Graham to have a good week in a Monday night matchup against the Rams. It should be a relatively high-scoring game. I actually take that back. It's a 44.5 point over/under.
Yeah,
that was wrong there. But regardless, I think
it's gonna be a grind.
It is. But what's crazy about Jimmy Graham? It's a situation. I don't really care about the talent with him. Like I think we can all agree he's past his prime. But when you look at team pass plays per game, we look at Chicago, they're 6th in pass plays per game. This team is actually passing the ball a lot, especially since Nick Foles has come in, and Nick Foles has looked to Jimmy Graham often in the end zone and in the red zone. Jimmy Graham right now is 5th amongst all tight ends in targets, 6th in terms of total receptions, And he already has 4 touchdowns, which is 5th amongst all tight ends as well. So, look, it's just a guy that it's a dart throw. But for a guy who's number 1 amongst tight ends in red zone targets with 10 of those, we'll see if he ends up coming down with them. He's only come down with them 40% of the time. But that type of volume is what you're looking for. Give yourself the opportunity to have a tight end that's going to score a touchdown. And that's why if you need it, Jimmy Graham can be a streamer in week 7. And that's my tight end start of the week. So, Alex,
I love it.
Heck of an episode. I think we broke down a lot here, and we're going to see a lot more here in this week 7 slate. A lot of great matchups. Before we sign off here, anything else to add? Any dart throw names that we should keep an eye on? You just want to name drop before we sign off?
I mean, I know I roasted Marvin Jones earlier, but I just want to say in that matchup against Atlanta, he's still playing 90+% of snaps every week. If he does play, he's been a little bit banged up. I think Marvin Jones could have a get-right game here. So maybe in a deeper league desperation situation, keep an eye on Marvin Jones, and if he bounces back, maybe we'll get some value out of him for the rest of the year.
Very interesting. Nice. MJJ, we were on that train preseason. It's kind of fizzled out, and that's why we've seen this TJ Hawkinson little emergence here. He's now become the number 2 on that team. But a name I want to throw out, a deep, probably going to be in some DFS lineups type of name. He's in an ugly matchup against New England, but it's Tim Patrick for the Denver Broncos. Just throwing him out there. I'm not going to give you a full take on him. I'm just saying if you are extremely desperate, if something happens, maybe there's a COVID outbreak, and you just need a guy to plug in at the very last second, I think you can do worse than Tim Patrick, who's really right now operating as the one for the Denver Broncos. But guys, thank you all so much for listening and watching. We had an absolute blast recording this one. Heck of an episode. If you like what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button. That is huge for us. A like is always appreciated as well. We'll see you guys on some live streams. Had an absolute blast with that one. Want to do more in the future. And hit us with those start-sit questions on Twitter at DoubleMoveSport or in the comments down below. Again, appreciate you all listening and watching, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace.